Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for showing up, and thank you to all of you who are watching us on YouTube. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful guest today, the first non-virtual guest of our Ecopoetological laboratory here at Warsaw University, which is part of our non-anthropocentric cultural subjectivity research center led by Professor Paweł Piszczatowski. The laboratory is created by myself, my name is Julia Fiedorczuk, and Professor Gerardo Beltran, who's watching us online tonight. So let me say a few words about our guest. Adam Dickinson came from Canada. He's a well-known Canadian poet, one of the most interesting, one of the most experimental voices in Anglophone poetry these days. Someone who's also radically transdisciplinary in his approach. He's a poet and a researcher, the author of 4 books of poetry, the last of which, Anatomic, involves the results of chemical and microbial testing on his own body. His previous book, Polymers, was a kind of poetic meditation on plastics as well as natural polymers. His work has been nominated for numerous prizes and translated into many languages, including Chinese, Dutch, French, German, Norwegian, and Polish also now. And he's also on this year's jury of the Griffin Prize. So welcome, Adam. It's wonderful to have you here. Okay, so the floor is yours now. I'm just going to go away. And everybody will be welcome to ask questions at the end. So those of you who are here, as well as our viewers on YouTube, are welcome to make comments, just say hello, or ask questions.
Thank you very much. It is a privilege and an honor to be here, and especially to be the first in-person, to be presiding or present for the first in-person seminar of what, the new year, the post-pandemic era? I don't know. Well, I suppose I shouldn't make any more predictions about the pandemic, but I'm honored and privileged to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me, Julia, and to your colleagues as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the context for my work, and I'm going to share some poems with you, and talk also about some new work that I've been doing that extends some of my laboratory experimental approach to thinking poetry, metabolism, environment, science, these kinds of intersections. Metabolism, the metabolism of our bodies is connected to the metabolism of the planet. We transform, reshape, or write our environment by polluting it, by modifying nutrient flows and biogeochemical cycles. In response, our environment writes us through changed hormonal signals caused by endocrine disrupting chemicals or altered gut microbial communities induced by industrialized diets and lifestyles. My work is concerned with this complicated interplay between the outside and the inside, and the writing that happens between and through the porous membrane that separates them. Situated at the intersection between science and art, my poetic practice integrates creative writing with laboratory-based scientific experiments. My aim is to bring into focus the often inscrutable biological and cultural writing intrinsic to the Anthropocene by responding to the work of art in the work of art. That is to say, to the metabolic processes of human and non-human bodies and their inextricable link to the global metabolism of energy and capital. Poetry, I think, as writing most concerned with the limits of writing, that's kind of how I define poetry, writing most concerned with the limits of writing. It is, in my view, well positioned to respond to these extraordinary acts of inscription, making them legible in ways that might influence prevailing cultural and political conversations around pollution and public health. Sorry, I should have done this. So my critical and creative approach concerns the cultural, political, and environmental implications of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, that emerging era in geological history where humans have begun to significantly affect the planetary biogeochemical cycle. So we now move more sediment than all the rivers and oceans in the world. We fix more nitrogen through synthetic fertilizers than all the lightning or bacteria in the world, etc. I mean, we've become these planetary forces. So this is part of what defines the Anthropocene. And I suppose what I'm interested in thinking about as well are other measures of the Anthropocene, other markers. And in the case of the book that I did on chemicals, finding chemicals inside my body, some of them for me are an example then of the signature of the Anthropocene, seeing these chemicals inside the body as a marker. So writing and thinking in the Anthropocene requires staying with the trouble, Donna Haraway argues, being proximate to thorny entanglements, to the intertwined material semiotic worldings of ontologically heterogeneous partners and their natural cultural assemblages, as she calls them. She adds that it matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. Indeed, if we are to attend carefully to the ways in which stories matter and the ways in which matter makes stories, we must also reimagine what it means to read and write these stories. The Anthropocene constitutes a series of metabolic rifts, Mackenzie Wark observes, where one molecule after another is extracted by labor and technique to make things for humans. But the waste products don't return so that the cycle can renew itself. The social formations produced by oil and petrochemical-related industries create their own metabolic rifts by concentrating capital in massively unequal ways and accumulating forms of dependence on and desire for unsustainable products and lifestyles. Oil is a hyperobject, as Timothy Morton would say, that permeates our biological and cultural metabolism and also our literary tropes and technologies. And here I'm referring to some of the work that Stephanie Lemenager has done on this. Consequently, it requires of us, I think, new forms of literacy, sensitive to metabolisms and shifted senses of scale. I don't know how well you can see these slides as we go along here, but we'll see how it goes. So I propose that the biosemiotic effects of endocrine disrupting petrochemicals and anthropogenically inflected microbial communities constitute an emerging focus for literary practice and critical analysis, especially through the lens of new materialisms, ecopoetics, and eco-criticism. So just a note, I suppose, on the endocrine system. The endocrine system is that system of communication in the body. Hormones fly around, regulating, once again, the metabolism is sort of responsible for regulating the inside and the outside. When you're hungry, when you're cold, hormones are released, etc. So the endocrine system is really the basis of this hormonal message system. And I'm quite fascinated with it then as a possible site for poetic experimentation. And certainly, this is where the Anthropocene potentially intervenes in our bodies in quite significant ways. So biosemiotics is an emerging field in theoretical biology that studies the communicative dynamics between organisms and their environment, as well as the interpretive interactions within organisms at the endocrine, immunological, and reproductive system levels. By studying the signifying environments of organisms and the internal endosemiotic environments at the molecular level, biosemiotics emphasizes the importance of the semiosphere, which, as Jesper Hoffmeyer notes, is a sphere like the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, or the biosphere, except that, in his words, it consists of communication: sound, scent, movement, colors, forms, electrical fields, various waves, chemical signals, touch, and so forth. In short, the signs of life, as the biosemioticians call it. So the point is to demonstrate that life is a function of sign processes and systems. Now, biosemiotics has recently been taken up in eco-critical studies as part of a turn to new materialism, with its emphasis on reconfigured notions of ontology and agency. Stacy Alimo, for example, orients some of these concerns through her concept of transcorporeality, which reveals the interchanges and interconnections between various bodily natures. Karen Barad proposes a renovated conception of identity formed through what she calls intra-action, which signifies the mutual constitution of entangled agencies. Similarly, Jane Bennett's theory of vital materiality implicitly emphasizes biosemiotic processes by considering how vibrant matter, which includes things such as electricity, chemicals from landfills, and dietary fats, how all of these things have the capacity to alter human behavior and consequently political action. So I see my work as part of the literary and artistic manifestation of a larger metabolic turn across the social and ecological sciences, extending in different ways Marx's concept of the metabolic rift and its subsequent exploration by John Bellamy Foster, Mackenzie Wark, Matthew Gandy, Hannah Landecker, and many others. My work is similarly concerned with what Adam Benkard, Martin Grunfeld, Jens Hauser, and Louise Whiteley call a metabolic gaze, in that it is attentive to the complex material exchanges and transformations that link environments and bodies. My ongoing projects could be described as poetic experiments in staging what Landecker and Kelty call metabolic events, where environments matter ethically and materially. Metabolic processes are constantly at work within organisms to maintain balance within perpetually changing environments via thermoregulation, digestion, respiration, and other modulating mechanisms. In Aesthetic Experience of Metabolic Processes, Desiree Foster points out that metabolic processes keep the organism capable of acting. So in this way, we might say the very agency of the organism, with all its social, political, and biological consequences, is dependent on metabolism. So what I call metabolic poetics is a research creation practice concerned with the potential of expanded modes of reading and writing to shift the frames and scales of conventional forms of signification in order to bring into focus the often inscrutable biological and cultural writing intrinsic to the Anthropocene. So I'm interested in the global circulation of energy and money and how this relates to the bodily fluids circulating within us, because there are connections between those two. We wear the energy systems that power our societies in the forms of chemicals in our flesh and in the hormonal messages of the endocrine system. Our bodies contain shifting communities of microbes that reflect our dependence on processed, industrialized food production. As a result of these influences, metabolic rifts have developed within human bodies and societies. You can think of obesity epidemics or income inequality as forms of metabolic rift, as well as within larger planetary biogeochemical cycles. I mean, the collection of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is another example of a metabolic rift. So how might we expand our capacity for literacy as our awareness of intertwined material semiotic worldings grows? How do endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example, as modes of biosemiotic writing, put pressure on literary forms and genres? So I see metabolic poetics at work, for example, in the US poet Jen Bervens in her book called Silk Poems, which is a nanoscale poetic work on a silk biosensor designed to be implanted as a metabolic monitoring device into a human body. I also see it in a number of works published and produced by Dea Antonsen and Ida Benke as part of the Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology out of Copenhagen. In particular, Karen Belender's Raw Ass Milk Soap, these are soap poems made out of donkey breast milk and elements of a local environment. So these poems that embody their environment and their very materiality. And Morten Sondergaard's sugar poems. These are poems printed on sugar and reflecting about sugar. So recent examples of my own explorations in metabolic poetics include the Polymers, which Julia mentioned, which is about plastics, and Anatomic, which incorporates and responds to the results of chemical and microbial testing on my blood, my urine, my feces, and my skin. So I'll talk about these books, and then I want to talk about some new work that I've been doing that extends my practice in different ways. So The Polymers, my book The Polymers is an example of metabolic poetics in as much as it's concerned with combining the discourses, theories, and experimental procedures of the science of plastic materials with the language and culture of plastic behavior. As giant molecules made of numerous repeating parts, which is what polymers are, polymers can be considered, I think, a form of writing, both biologically, in terms of DNA, proteins, these are polymeric structures, and socially in terms of plastics. And I mean, we wear plastics, we sit on furniture made of plastics. It really sort of writes our social infrastructure. In creating this book, I incorporated research into reiterations, accumulations, repetitions, and accretions of various sorts. I wanted to think how I could understand analogs between culture and polymers. Polymers are these giant molecules that repeat. And I look for repetitive behavior, things that humans do, that cultures and societies are built around, that repeat in various ways. So I looked at things like financial credit, arguments, trends, fashions, anxieties, memes, archetypes, hoaxes, things that proliferate and repeat in different ways. I joined Facebook and other social media forums in order to further polymerize my life. My aim was to reimagine the structure of polymers, this chain-like repetitive dynamic, in terms of their culture, their petrocultural and linguistic analogs. So I made use of literary devices like anaphora, polysyndeton, these are rhetorical formations built around repetition, and puns, as well as poetic forms like the anagram, collage, and other appropriation and procedure-based methods. I also conducted site-specific research as a means of generating some of the poems. So for example, I stood in line at tourist attractions, recording found text from conversations around me as I would circulate through the line without ever getting on the ride or into the exhibit. I live in Canada, not too far from Niagara Falls, which is of course an international tourist destination. And there are all kinds of exhibits there, with some of them with very long lineups. There was a boat that you can take out into the falls, and the lineup actually goes all the way down a huge cliff. So I spent the day just circulating back and forth through the lineup, putting on the raincoat. But I would never get on the boat and trying to record things. At first I had a tape recorder, but that was too conspicuous. People were wondering what I was doing, so I just took notes. But in the end, I actually was regaled with all kinds of fascinating stories by the bored university students who were working in the lineup, guiding people through. They had crazy stories about the line. But it was about sort of being in the line as a kind of physical polymer and thinking and responding to that. So there's a few poems in the book that respond to that situation. So this experiment in textual chemistry, as I see it, seeks to sequence or map the social expression of the most common plastic resins. Now, you are familiar with these. If you turn over a water bottle, you'll see a little triangle on the bottom with a number. And there's always a number between 1 and 7, which refers to the specific resin that material is made from. So number 1 is polyester. Numbers 2 and 4 are polyethylene. Number 3 is polyvinyl chloride. Number 5 is polypropylene, number 6 is polystyrene, and number 7 is other. Beware number 7. This research has produced poems that function as the particular atomic constituents of the molecular formulas for each specific resin. All right, what do I mean by that? Okay, so this is the table of contents for the first section. I don't know how well you can see that, but what I've done here, this is the polyester section. So I've taken the most common form of polyester, which is polyethylene terephthalate, and the chemical formula for this substance is C10H8O4. And so I've taken the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen atoms and changed them into poems whose titles begin with a C or an H or an O in the same ratio. And so this is how the book is designed. Each section of the book has a necessary number of poems that reflect the chemical formula of the substance that's being considered in this case. So the idea was to be as plastic as possible in the formal composition of the book, so various constraints mix with visual poems. You'll see some visual poems here in a second, and speculative scientific investigations. I deliberately, I like to think that the book is funny in places. And that was intentional. Plastic, of course, is this overdetermined substance. It's at once a kind of kitschy, cheap substance. It's disposable. We throw things away made of plastic. We often associate them with cheapness. But of course, plastic is also a revolutionary technology in so many ways, and it's involved in all kinds of high-tech operations and manifestations. So it's this oddly contrasting substance, and it's of course we can make it into whatever we want. And so I wanted to play with this tonal variety in all kinds of different ways. So there's humor mixed in with serious poems as a way of playing with tone in a more complex way. So I'll read you an example from this book. The publisher actually very kindly put in a plastic page in it as well, which I was happy about. So that took a little bit of negotiating. So this is a poem that makes use of anaphora. So anaphora is a rhetorical form. You have repeated phrases at the beginnings of lines. And so I see this as, again, an example of a linguistic polymer. And it works here to generate a kind of interpolation, a kind of calling in the terms of the multi-species inhabitants of the plastosphere. You can read along. Hail. Hello. Hello from inside the albatross with a windproof lighter and Japanese police tape. Hello from staghorn coral beds waving at the beaked whale's mistake, all 6 square meters of fertilizer bags. Hello from can-open Delta gators taxidermied with 25 grocery sacks and a Halloween Hulk mask. Hello from the zipped-up leatherback who shat bits of rope for a month. Hello from bacteria making their germinal way to the poles in the pockets of packing foam. Hello from low-density polyethylene drop stones glacially tilled by desiccated bowel-obstructed camels. Hello from six-pack rings and chokeholds, from breast milk and cord blood, from microfibers rinsed through yoga pants and polyester fleece, biomagnifying predators strafing the treatment plants. Hello from acrylics and G.I. Joe. Hello from washed-up fishnet thigh highs and frog suits and egg cups and sperm. Hello. The repetitive cultural obsession with certain well-known texts led me to enact a series of experiments in the polymers. These are just some of the visual poems. In the last section of the book, the other section, number 7, I wanted to see if I could find the repeating chemical units at the heart of some controversial, culturally influential texts that have been subjected to their own forms of historical repetition and obsession. So of the many texts I worked with, I looked at famous speeches, I looked at transcripts from the moon landing, influential books, just books that themselves kind of proliferate polymerically through culture or texts. So the ones that yielded the best results for me were Darwin's The Origin of Species and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a section of the Canadian Constitution. It turns out it's a silicon-based polymer, which who could have predicted such a thing? So what I did was, this was a playful exercise, and I exposed these texts to different kinds of sorting procedures where I looked for word length, I looked for word frequency, as identifying most common nouns and other grammatical patterns. I was just trying a way to sort this information. So the idea was to find a way to translate textual information into a molecular formula. The structures that I came up with are all imaginary, but they're functional molecules, so they could be real. In fact, I did my best to determine what sorts of properties these chemicals might have based on the nature of their composition. And I worked with a chemist to make sure I was being as accurate as possible. And this was sort of the beginning of my work with scientists, which has really kind of proliferated after this. So I'll show you the results. These are a little longer essays. I won't read them here. They're sort of lyrical, playful essays in the book, but they explain some of the procedures and how I came to actually produce these materials, but I'll show them to you. Oops. So one on the left, which I'm probably blocking with my head, is called, I have named it ditetraiodoualwanine, and it is the plastic, it's the repeat unit at the heart of Darwin's The Origin of Species. And it is made from a carbon and iodine polymer that produces a thin, transparent film that fails to completely crystallize, and the essay explores this a little bit. So the result is the overlooked significance of glare in Darwin's work. Now the other one, the other molecule here on the right, I have named polyphenylsiloxane. And now there are naming conventions with polymers, I discovered. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is built from a silicone-based polymer, which, as I mentioned, I believe is a first for a human rights document. And it has a selective gas permeability. It also has very high molecular weight. It's a huge molecule. However, it possesses odd material properties as a result of this that allow it to both drip and bounce at the same time. So this, of course, is manifested in various ways in Canadian politics. So it was interesting to play around with these texts and to try to find, as I say, only some of them worked because only some of them yielded molecules that actually could exist in the real world. Others, according to the methods I was using, did not yield those results. And so these images are in the book as well, as part of the visual element. So I worked with scientists in making some of the images for the polymers, but I extended that approach much further in my next book, Anatomic. So to write Anatomic, I conducted biomonitoring and microbiome testing on my body to look at the way that the outside writes the inside in necessary ways. So for example, bacteria. Bacteria regulate all kinds of aspects of our bodies, the immune system, physiological development. We rely, for example, on, 95% of the serotonin in your body is produced by microbes in your gut. And serotonin is a necessary neurotransmitter. It's involved with regulating our moods and personalities. So in a sense, we've outsourced the maintenance of our humanness, our moods, to these non-human organisms, which is quite fascinating to me. So I was looking at how the outside writes the inside in necessary ways in the context of evolutionary history when it comes to microbes and our relationship with them for millions of years, and also harmful ways in the context of chemical pollution, which I found inside my body. So I made a biosemiotic catalog. I think of it in this way anyway, as a sort of these toxicological and symbiotic circumstances. And I turned it into a species of writing, a chemical/microbial autobiography. So these are some of the chemicals that I tested, but I don't know how we can read these here, but there are phthalates. Those are associated with plastics, and air fresheners. Those are actually kind of everywhere, phthalates. I thought I would have low levels because after I wrote the book on plastics, I consciously tried to, limit my exposure to plastics to some degree. I tried not to microwave things in plastics, but it turned out I had high levels of phthalates, of some phthalates, which and we metabolize them really quickly. They're kind of through our bodies in about 24 hours, so it suggested to me that I'm really kind of bathing in phthalates. We all are. They're around us. There's quite a bit on money, actually. What else? PCBs, there's some pesticides, there are some heavy metals, some flame retardants, things like this. So I tested myself for chemicals widely present in the environment and believed to exist in most humans to varying degrees. So what is inside me is inside you too, which is the point of the book. Moreover, in addition to testing various areas of my body for bacteria, so I tested my hands, my genitals, my ear, nose, and mouth. I wanted to sort of take a representative sample of bacteria on the outside of my body. I also sequenced my microbiome on the inside with the help of researchers at several universities. So I obtained a deep metagenome and virome characterization of a stool sample. All of this was quite involved research, and you can actually do this much more easily now. You can send away for some of these kits. But I was doing this about 7 years or 8 years ago now, more than that. And at the time, these things didn't exist. So I kind of had to befriend scientists, and I was helping them with their research, and they were helping me with theirs. And I was keeping food diaries as a result because they wanted to know what I was eating so they could, compare some of the microbial communities, which led to some very obsessive behaviors on my part as I started to pay attention to things that I'd never paid attention to. So I explore some of the psychological effects in the book, actually. By focusing, you probably can't see this, but these are the microbial communities as represented in a particular pattern here. But by focusing on the outside that is inside, my hope is to draw attention to the coextensive and interactive nature of the body with its environment and the consequent implications for linking the human to the non-human and the personal to the global in environmental ethics. And I should say that while I am acutely aware of the way my body is necessarily marked by certain demographic privileges, I'm also interested in the strange democratizing power of this form of pollution and biological colonization. So it is true, people, who's more likely to live near industrial sites or toxic waste sites? Land is less valuable there, so you have class disparities that can influence the kind of pollution that you might be exposed to. But nonetheless, the pollution is in all of us. You can find these chemical signatures. Yes, it may be distinct for different communities of people, but the chemicals and microbes are in us all. So you'll see some images here as well. This one is not very clear here, but that blue dot in the middle is a white blood cell, my white blood cell, around many of my red blood cells. So I did some microscope photography as part of this project as well, and these images are in the book because I wanted to look at the excretory pathways that some of these chemicals take. So I did microscope images of my hair, my sweat, my urine, what else? My blood, and you'll see some of these as I proceed here. They're quite. Got some very interesting images out of this, but I sort of think of it as a kind of metabolic landscape photography. It took me about 7 years from start to finish to complete the book, and as I mentioned, I explored some of the effects that this had on me. It really did change my life, actually, writing this book and doing this research. I looked into my blood, my urine, and my poop, and I saw the Anthropocene staring back at me. And I wrote about what I found. So I'll read you some examples. The poem that I'll read here now from Anatomic was written in response to discovering a chemical called 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzoedioxin. It's often just called dioxin, but there are a whole class of chemicals known as dioxins. Dioxins are a class of persistent organic pollutants, which means they're not easily broken down in the environment, so they tend to biomagnify through food chains. There's a good chance that anyone listening or watching online or even here in this room, there's a good chance that you have measurable amounts of dioxin in your body. Dioxins have a very interesting industrial, cultural, and political history. And again, this was part of what I was doing with the book. I did research on these chemicals. Where do they come from? How are they used? What are their histories? And this particular chemical is a byproduct of industrial processes, such as the chlorine bleaching of pulp and paper. It was also produced in the manufacture of some herbicides, including famously Agent Orange, which was used as a defoliant in the Vietnam War and led to a legacy of health problems. This chemical is also believed to be the poison covertly administered in the attempted assassination of Viktor Yushchenko in 2004 during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Dioxins are toxic, they are carcinogenic, they interfere in various ways with the endocrine system, as I was talking about before, the system of hormonal communication. So my poem responds to dioxin in part by reflecting on the complex history of the chemical, as well as my own personal exposure history. I spent a significant portion of my life living and traveling in central and northern Ontario in Canada, never far from pulp and paper mills and their distinctive sulfurous smell and insidious environmental footprint. I will read this poem for you. I should mention as well that each of the poems in the book, there's an epigraph associated with them that indicates the level of a particular chemical in my blood or urine, or else the presence of a microbe on or in my body. This is called Agents Orange, Yellow, and Red, and it's written in response to 2378 tetrachlorodibenzoedioxin. My serum level is 1.304348 picograms per gram lipid. You are either for chlorine or for the plague. Right now is the cleanest we have ever been. And for this you must love aerial defoliants, or you love communism. Under the bandage of this one industry town closing ranks around staples of forestry and fish, the wound is wide-eyed and headstrong. Through the clearing, freshwater carp blink past the graves of missionaries who introduced them to the New World. Northern rivers are warmed by the paper mill's piss, which, like making the world safe for democracy, slowly leaked into my childhood, yellowing the lipophilic paperbacks of my adipose fat. You are for pulp or for poverty. You respect the Constitution or you stare at the ground lost in bankruptcies for herring gull beaks or blurred embryos in cormorant colonies. Every erected media platform reduces the problem of war to a problem of tint. During the Orange Revolution, Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned by government agents who haywired his food with dioxin. His face flared into pages of acne. You are either for the red or the white blood cells, for the tops of trees or the bottoms. So the tension between the individual and the larger crowd was one of the primary tensions of this book. Both hormones as well as microbes respond to behave according to something called quorum sensing, how many other species are present or how much of this hormone is in the body. And so this idea of the crowd and the individual and the relationship between the two of them was something I thought quite a bit about. Are there ways in which our chemically and microbially crowded bodies might be seen as an opportunity to write about and against the prevailing political pressures that have generated these kinds of metabolic interventions that I've been talking about? So I can see Monsanto, the company, written into my blood as I read the results of my PCB tests. And I know that because I grew up in Canada and Monsanto produced all of the PCBs that continue to linger in the environment there. In Europe, it's a little bit different. There were different companies, so I can't tell you specifically what company might be inside you. But for me, it's Monsanto. What gives a company the right to effectively edit our bodies without our consent? What happens when this writing is made legible? So my interest in thinking crowds through hormonal cascades has emerged from an interest in these questions. And I've also been working as a result of this with disruption or interruption in the context of crowds and bacteria colonies. So I've cultured some bacteria that I swabbed from my body on some text in order to generate this disruptive crowded writing. And I don't know how well you can see this here. But this piece is a quotation from Cortez's second letter to Charles V upon meeting Montezuma in Mexico on the 8th of November, 1519. And it's colonized with bacteria that I swabbed from money and from my hands after touching money. So the crowd of microbes, the result of the interaction between bodies and systems of exploitation and exchange, have been invited here to participate in the creation of an erasure text. So these images are in the book as well. Now, as the biologist Scott F. Gilbert points out, birth is not the birth of a so-called individual. Birth is the continuation of the holobiont community, the holobiont being the organism plus its persistent community of symbiont microbes. So you plus all your microbes are the holobiont, or your holobiont. So with that in mind, this poem was written in response to a microbe that I acquired very early in my life. It will become clear in a moment. And I should also mention that this poem makes reference to the Voyager space probes and the golden records that were sent out in the 1970s as an attempt to make communication with extraterrestrial beings. And so, there were some records and things on the spacecraft. So that, there's a link in the poem made between space exploration and microbes. So as I mentioned, this is for a microbe I acquired very early in my life. It's called galactic acid, and it's in response to the microbe Lactobacillus acidophilus. For the first 2 years of my life, my mother's vaginal flora lived in my stomach. Consigned to the edge of their star system, they ate everything I ate, fermenting chains of starch into acids that fed the high energy demands of trying to erect an antenna. The flora flexed for deep space, convinced they weren't alone. They transmitted their contractions and hoped to reach aliens before the terrible facsimiles of the 1970s, humans drawn without sex organs and burdened by messages whose content had become instructions for reading. Set amidst this mucosa, a gram-stained parabolic reflector waited for word from newcomers. We're a lot alike, my mother and I. Our disdain for underachieving campsites, and the way we signal for help by maintaining a slight underbite during awkward conversations. Her vagina made me cosmopolitan. A dialectic crowned in the forest, its many antlers have since come to crowd my self-possession with spent velvet. I watch my mother favor her disintegrating hips. The small party that left her for the new world founded a settlement on a moon she still tracks without looking. Its tidal pull on the pit of her stomach makes her pause at the zenith of a phone call. What is it? I also, in the book, there's a whole series that I think of as specimen reports, and the reflections that I had as I undertook some of these experiments. Some strange things happened to me. I ended up getting in trouble at the university because I was drawing blood, and I was not doing it according to the proper rules and procedures. I had to ship hazardous, stool samples across the border, which because I was using labs in the United States, the University of Colorado, to help me. And so there was something. I'll just read you an example of one of these specimen reports. It looked like I was going to have to shit in Buffalo. I needed to send a stool sample across the border, and it would be easier to simply go to Buffalo, produce what needed to be produced, and send it from there. The problem was that it appeared I was going to need a significant amount, more than one sitting, and I would have to freeze it. I wasn't holding out much hope for a hotel room with a deep freezer. I weighed my options. Strange to spend a weekend in Buffalo with the sole purpose of collecting and mailing my poop. In the end, the paperwork came through, and I carefully placed everything to harden in our basement freezer. Yes, my wife did not appreciate this material stored in the freezer. So I want to switch a little bit here and move on to some new work. I see my work as subscribing to an auto guinea pig principle in the spirit of Paul B. Preciado, in which I'm quoting Preciado here. Anyone wishing to be a political subject will begin by being the lab rat in her or his own laboratory. And so I've taken that to heart. That's from Testo Junkie. The experiment and the laboratory occupy more than figurative or thematic concerns in my work. They're fundamentally part of my artistic process. So as part of enacting a conversation with an interrogative dynamic, as Joan Retallack puts it in her essay, What is Experimental Poetry and Why Do We Need It?, the experiment for me is not only what potentially produces the poem, but it is also intrinsically part of the work of the poem itself. It's metabolism, we might say. It is the context made content. The laboratory for me is a site of conceptual experimentation and collaboration. I like to think of its potential for a social poetics in Mark Nowak's terms. How might the laboratory experiment constitute a kind of workshop open to collaboration, resurgence, and innovation with human and non-human kin? I've also come to think of aspects of my process, especially my work with microbes, as staging acts of micro-performativity. Jens Hauser and Lucy Strecker argue that micro-performativity denotes a current trend in theories of performativity and performative artistic practices to destabilize human scales, both spatial and temporal, as the dominant plane of reference, and to emphasize biological and technological micro-agencies that relate the invisibility of the microscopic to the incomprehensibility of the macroscopic. So these collisions and shifts between scales bring into focus, for me, the inscrutable biological and cultural writing intrinsic to the Anthropocene that I have been talking about. So my recent work has been focusing on the senses as both a mechanism through which we perceive the Anthropocene and anthropogenic environmental changes, and also as a site that has been affected by those changes. Again, thinking about the way the outside writes the inside. So our hearing, for example, must contend with noise pollution. Our eyes with light pollution and ubiquitous computer screens. Our noses with chemical pollution from phthalates and other artificial smells. Our sense of taste is bombarded with synthetic and industrially processed foods. Our sense of touch is affected by higher temperatures in the world, among many other things. I also want to think of the senses in more expanded terms. So for example, our sense of touch might be extended to our guts and their resident microbes that constitute an outside within us, coming into contact with the food we eat and influencing our health, perceptions, and personalities. There's also the gut feeling, or interoception it's called, feeling the world inside us. So feeling your heartbeat or your organs. These are forms of touch and feeling. There are in fact even smell receptors in the kidneys. As Hannah Lendecker and others have pointed out, which is quite fascinating. So there's all these chemosensory elements inside our body that we actually know very little about. It is this expanded sense of the senses that I want to explore as a performative and experimental engagement with the intersecting metabolic dimensions of the Anthropocene. Indeed, the feelings of fear or foreboding that many people sense in response to environmental challenges such as climate change have real metabolic effects, raising stress hormones, causing psychological anguish. My writing continues to interweave treatments of local and global metabolism, implicitly proposing that renovated approaches to environmental and social problems in the Anthropocene are enlivened by thinking and writing immersively within their biological, cultural, and historical contexts. Through ongoing laboratory experiments, variously involving heat stress, my own microbes, and electrodermal activity, my recent poems make visible the problems associated with climate change, antibiotic resistance, microplastic pollution, and sound pollution, among other concerns, as they are legible in a body, a human body, my body in this case, and in the larger context of biological, social, and political activities. So part of my recent work on the senses has involved exploring the metabolic poetics of heat as a form of touch here, thermoregulation. How does heat, for example, or the thermoregulatory processes of humans and non-humans constitute forms of writing? In a warming world, how might heat be invited into renovated poetic forms and compositional methods? So I have pursued some of these questions through a series of recent experiments. In one case, with the assistance of one of my colleagues at my university, Dr. Stephen Chung, and his laboratory, I've undertaken several heat stress trials. I did this already just before the pandemic, although I've been trying to get, but all this laboratory work had a huge gap. I'm just getting started in it again, actually. So I raised my internal body temperature by around 1.5 degrees Celsius through active heating. So I was cycling in a very hot enclosed environment. And I also through passive heating. So I wore this sort of this jacket that has hot water pipes through it, and I just sat there for 5 hours slowly heating up, which is actually very distressing. It's one thing if you're exercising and you get hot, your body is prepared in some ways for that discomfort, but if you just sit there for 5 hours and slowly heat up, it's actually really anxiety provoking. Your heart starts to pound, because that's what happens actually as you start to enter hyperthermia. So anyway, this was quite deliberate. I wanted to explore this. In one experiment involved prolonged exposure to the critical wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. I won't get into the complexities. It's kind of tricky to explain what wet bulb temperature is. But essentially, it's a point where you have a temperature and humidity that are so high that the human body can no longer cool itself by sweating. And this is an atmospheric phenomenon forecast to become more frequent in parts of the world due to climate change. It's already happened in a few places. So at various intervals during these trials, I wrote, I took cognitive tests, I measured my core temperature, skin temperature, blood pressure, my CO2 uptake, brain blood flow, among other data. And so using this data, I have and I will continue to write poems that invite temperature extremes into the compositional process and reflect on my altered, anxious, mental, and physical state. So, the more that I reflect on my experiences of hypothermia, of this heat, the more I think of fevers, bad dreams, and addled thinking. Global warming has already given rise to conspiracy theories and a desperate, pressurized thinking as vulnerable populations themselves have become desperate and pressurized. So these poems respond in various ways to feverish thinking. So I'll read an example for you. This one's called Freeze, and in response, I suppose, to some of these data points, 38.5 degrees Celsius internal temperature, 88 heartbeats per minute, oxygen consumption, 0.34 liters per minute. It's late in the experiment. Sweat marbles the half-life of a flushed face, brailed with illicit desires to be devoured by an art school of muscle relaxants. My daughter wakes me with her fear of the dark, and the dark, as it kindles the morning, in its keyhole bird calls, opening the back doors of dreams in which dogs tear her parents limb from limb. She's scared of the brain stem sunshine on the street, where the glare from windshields provides cover for the organ-heavy flowers that grow straight up from their beds through gallbladders and lungs to peer from the eyes of pedestrians with deciduous teeth. I tell her nightmares are an immune response, the body giving itself a needle, so that when the real thing comes, you will know what to do. And the sweat on my face is a fogged lens, directionless. So recently, I have been focusing on the digestive system as an interior sense of touch. So it constitutes a kind of corridor of the outside running within and through our bodies, and also extending my thinking around the microbiome as a kind of poetics. So through microbiome sequencing, I have already identified the presence of 45 distinct antibiotic-resistant genes in my gut. Antibiotics come from dirt. All of our reservoir on Earth, really, for antibiotics at this point is the dirt. This is where we find this, because the dirt is the locus for the greatest evolutionary war on this planet that's taken place between viruses and bacteria fighting each other. And so there's been, millions of years of history of microbes developing their own antibiotics, and it's in the dirt, and this is where we find them. But we're running out of options for antibiotics at this point through antibiotic resistance that has developed as a result of this, which is a very natural process for microbes to develop resistance to things that are trying to kill them. And they have this wonderful capacity that we don't have as humans, or at least, we don't have it. It's called horizontal gene transfer. So basically, we can just exchange genes. Microbes can do that. They can just change genes back and forth. Whereas we have to have offspring, and those genes get passed on, and et cetera, and sort of work through reproductive history, which takes a long time for genetic transmission to happen. But microbes can just share them back and forth. And so this is how this can happen so quickly. So anyway, I have identified the presence of these 45 distinct antibiotic-resistant genes in my gut. Antibiotics come from dirt. By eating them, and by them I'm referring to antibiotics, and rubbing them on our skin through creams, and medications, essentially, we have brought the behaviors and customs of soil ecology above ground into our bodies, changing countless microbes accustomed to living on and in us, forcing them to adapt to resistance strategies, essentially, from the world of dirt, and turning historically benign commensal species into potentially dangerous threats. So we have, in effect, altered the microbial commons. Our interior sense of touch has been changed. And so you can think of the atmosphere as a kind of commons, and so this is part of the argument about why we need to regulate pollution pumped into the atmosphere by countries around the world. We all share the atmosphere. Well, in fact, we also share a kind of microbial commons around the world. These microbes move and shift, and you can watch, actually, the spread of antibiotic-resistant genes as they'll move with remarkable rapidity, remarkable speed around the world. So yes, we have changed this microbial commons that we are surrounding ourselves with as well. So I'm currently in the middle of a series of experiments with a microbiologist, happening this minute actually while I'm here back in Canada, these experiments involve employing a bioreactor that mimics the human colon. So essentially what I'm doing here is, you see this is what the bioreactor looks like, but I'm making I'm using these reactors as a kind of proxy me, like another me. And so I'm taking my gut microbes and putting them in the machine, and it's mirroring my own lower intestine. So I can perform experiments on me without having to take all the drugs. I can sort of, put them in the bioreactor. So I've got a few things planned. I'll be looking at the effects of exposures to xenobiotics such as triclosan. This is an antibiotic. It's often in like hand creams and things. It's like the craze of sort of antibiotic resistant, antibacterial soaps, things like this. Triclosan, it's in toothpaste as well. It's a very common, a chemical. So I want to look at this on its effect on the mobilization of antibiotic-resistant genes in my gut. What does it do? How does these genes mobilize and move inside me? I will also be inducing an extinction event in a sample of my own gut flora through the application of strong antibiotics. So bombard. I just did this actually. I'm waiting for the results. So what's left? What is left afterwards? Those survivors, those species. Who are they? What are they? And once I find out, I will do research on these and develop some artwork and poems out of this. And following this, what kind of I want to observe the effects of artificial dyes, artificial sweeteners, and on this post-antibiotic treated sample as compared to a control. So what kind of microbial landscape might emerge nourished entirely by artificial foods? What would this look like? So this is, while extreme, these speculative yet scientifically informed experiments engage, to my mind, with the kinds of medical, dietary, and commercial pressures at work in the Anthropocene. So these are extreme experiments, but nonetheless, they're kind of consistent if you sort of extend the logic of the trajectories that we're on in terms of the use of antibiotics and also the development of synthetic foods in this way. So I'm also looking at whether, and this one I'm quite excited about, whether bio-augmenting my gut microbes with a species of worm, whether this can lead to the degradation of microplastics. So a recent study has concluded that humans eat on average of about 5 grams of microplastics per week. And mealworms have been observed breaking down common plastics in laboratory settings. Mealworms are a relatively common species. So what I want to do is test the effectiveness of these worms and their resident gut microbes at integrating with my own worms. So I don't have to eat them. I'll put them inside my gut in the bioreactor and see if my microbiome changes as a result of that, and then feed microplastics in there and seeing if my sort of worm-augmented gut can digest these microplastics. The idea is to sort of work with the microbes here as a kind of kin, as human kin. My plan would be to develop a prototype pill. Of course, it would be an art project ultimately. This is really a very small sample, this scientific experiment, but it would. There is some. This hasn't been done before actually. So this is an art project, but it's also participating in a kind of, I don't know, avant-garde science, I suppose. I'm thankful for my colleagues in the sciences who are willing to indulge me in these experiments. But Heather Davis and Zoe Todd, the critics, among others, have written about what it might mean to extend Donna Haraway's injunction in Staying with the Trouble, to see petrochemicals and the life forms they support as kin. And I see my work in this context as a form of multi-species metabolic kin-making. How might we, think of the worms then as kin in this historical moment where we have to deal with microplastics? You can't avoid them. How might we, develop these kin relationships with organisms that might help us? So I'll read you, this is a recent poem that responds to some of this research and data. This poem is based in part on information that I acquired from sequencing my microbiome, which, as I mentioned, revealed the presence of 45 distinct antibiotic-resistant genes in my gut, including several associated with something called an efflux pump. So this is a mechanism that some bacteria have for getting rid of antibiotics. This is how they become resistant. It's a really simple mechanism. It's just a pump. So the antibiotic gets into the microbial cell, the microbial cell pumps it out like a sump pump. And so these genes then code for this protein. So the poem explores it's called an efflux pump. The poem explores the efflux pump in relation to antibiotic resistance acquired by my father, who died this past summer and acquired antibiotic-resistant microbes during his final days in hospital before succumbing to leukemia. But the poem also explores the figure and function of pumps more generally as mechanisms for memory and thinking. And I'll just say, because this is relevant to the poem, I was very close to my dad. He lived his life as a science teacher and an environmentalist, and so, you know, by way of countless canoe trips and camping trips with him through the Canadian Arctic, for example, we did a number of big trips. He instilled in me a deep love of nature and science, which I carry on with my work. And so I feel his loss deeply. And I think, you know, and I've been thinking more about this actually as I've sort of, it hasn't even been a year yet, and so I still think about him a lot. And I think about the way in which grief actually is has metabolic effects, as I'm sure, I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced grief in some form or another, you know, lack of appetite, distraction, things like this. So these are the metabolic effects that emerge from these kinds of experiences. So it fits into to the work that I've been doing here. So I'll read this poem. It's called "A Pump is the Dream of Starting Over." You might have died, but not here, and not here. The water pump summons the well with rheumatic recollection. I move pictures from our trip to the Arctic into a waterproof box, the two of us in raincoats, our wrists taped to keep black flies from siphoning blood, while we carried canoes across tundra through swarms bloated with pricked mammalian veins, clouds of transfused units fur-born above us, foreshadowing the drip bags of your late-stage leukemia. What has happened can unhappen, declares the sump pump, moving the thunderstorm from the cellular efflorescence of our cellar. My microbes pump methane from the starches of bananas. I have drug-resistant genes in my gut, guarding plans for an efflux pump, expelling medicant diplomats from cytoplasmic intelligence. When your hospital-acquired resistance was strengthening, they switched classes to avoid the moles, plaguing your legs with starred rivers. To prime a pump, you must inflict it with a small sample of the flood. Your ashes are stacked in a jar. Every night, a dream pumps a trail of embers into the stove behind my eyes. So there's me and my dad in 1987. So while the gut constitutes an outside surface within the interior of my body, I'm also interested in it as a figurative site of human intuition, right? The gut sense. You feel it in your gut. Consequently, I'm also adding a sample of my father's cremated remains to one of the RoboGut bioreactors containing my microbes. And the reason I'm doing this, the idea will be to see what changes result from the presence of the ashes in relation to a control. And I'm struck by the possibility of interpreting any resulting shifts in the microbiota as evidence of a possible message from my deceased father. Moreover, this message would necessarily emerge from the gut, the symbolic home of human instinct and intuition. And I can think of many examples where people have sought direction from deceased loved ones and interpreted those messages as a feeling in the gut. So if I could point to some microbial shifts, well, you know, what if I could do this? Point to some, I'm confident there will be some microbial. It's like running the same experiment twice. To what degree this responds or reflects on the ashes is difficult to say, but nonetheless, I mean, it's one way of reading this inflection, this difference. What are those different microbial species, and what kind of message might they convey? I'll have to figure out what microbes, what the differences are, and then go from there. So here, I've been starting actually, I don't know how well you can see this, but these are electron microscope images of my dad's ashes actually, and I'm intrigued by them in part because they sort of explode the idea of scale here. It's almost like these are asteroids from outer space, but they're also, you know, they could be extreme close-ups, which of course they are at an electron microscope. So playing around with scales, is this micro or macro? And so, yeah, this movement of the inside and the outside that I've been talking to you about is also, there's a parallel interest in the micro and macro at the same time. So I had a sound piece that I was going to play for you, but I guess I'll tease you a little bit and suggest you come on Friday because I'm hoping to play it then. But I've been doing some work with sound and noise pollution, in particular something called the hum, and I'll ask you guys. I don't know if people have heard of people suffering or being bothered by persistent hums or noises. This is a thing around the world, and there are databases collecting this. It's kind of been on the rise since the 1970s, the hum. And so I've worked with some sound engineers and created kind of proximity or approximate version of the hum. I play a little bit around with that with some writing in relation to sound. But yeah, you can come on Friday if you're interested, and I'll perform that for you. But just to conclude, what does it mean to rethink ecological identity in the Anthropocene as a function of potent interactions between environmental toxins, symbiotic organisms, and anthropogenically influenced sensory experiences? I want to see my own body, the chemicals in my blood and urine, the Western diet influenced microbes in my stomach, and the metabolic effects of sensory experiences as forms of media, transmedia. Expressing the biology of petroculture, expressing my own strange intimacy with the energy sources of my historical moment. So being able to read the stories of the chemicals and microbes, as well as temperature extremes, antibiotics, and sound pollution in our bodily fluids and reflexes, means being able to read the writing of the Anthropocene in ways we haven't been able to do yet, in ways that might illuminate the common crowds we bear and the crowds in common that we are. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, but I wouldn't want to begin with my own questions. So maybe there's anything that you would like to say as a comment or as a question, anybody?
All right, hello. First off, just a quick comment and then maybe a bigger question. As you were talking about the intestines, right? I thought that it's actually one of the one of the original means for scrying and for telling the future, right?
Right, yes.
It's got a very deep sort of an anthropological source, right? And incidentally also, the way it worked is you'd have to have special technique, like a poet maybe, and you'd have to arrange those intestines and read them, right, in a way connecting the inside with the bigger outside, because obviously that's all of that scrying was about, the moods of gods and, favors and, stuff like that. So I thought that it's a kind of a way of joining, the inside and the outside through procedure.
That is a fascinating point. You know what? Of course, I know what you're talking about, but I never actually made that connection. But you're absolutely right. I have a whole forest of reading here in front of me to consult that, because I think that's a fascinating link to make. You're right, absolutely. So the divination, right? The divining from the intestines of the animal, the future, the prospects of whatever it is you're seeking a message from. But absolutely, yeah. No, that's something that I will definitely reflect upon in relation to this. I like that idea a lot. Thank you.
All right, and just a quick question. You mentioned, you talked a lot about the limits of writing or textual chemistry, and I was wondering what would that mean? What kind of a form of writing would we be gravitating towards, right? I really like the idea developed by Catherine Malabou, who talks about plasticity.
Yes.
And she says that today's age is plastic in a way, and there needs to emerge some kind of a form of writing that would be plastic as well, which in her perspective is that it can both give meaning, but it also has to accept meaning, that it can be remodeled. And I don't know, maybe that's something, maybe that's a step toward that collaborative writing, or like overhauling the idea of authorship.
Yeah, I mean, writing...
Would that go as far as, copyright concerns? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, writing Malibu, right? Writing is a kind of thermoplastic in a sense, right? You can remold it and it responds as well as bears inscription. Yeah, I mean, I think that talking about samples and collage work and appropriation techniques, certainly with that book, I deliberately was doing all of that. There are texts that are are anagrams of existing texts. So in the way that a chemical molecule is an anagram, ultimately, if you take carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, you just put it together in different ratios, you're dealing with the same atomic substances, but you can get or elements, but get a completely different substance, which is, in a sense, what you get from an anagram inside language. And so there are playful techniques in the book that make use of that. I mean, I don't settle necessarily on one specific plastic form, partly because, I mean, I think that plastic itself is, as I mentioned, a kind of overdetermined material substance in all kinds of different ways. So I was attracted to the variety of different possible mechanisms, hence the use of certain rhetorical forms and sampling and collage as a function of that, and visual poems too. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot about this question of form, absolutely. And with Anatomic, it was a real challenge because I wanted to, I had thought perhaps, you know, I could develop a form of asemic writing, which would, you know, take this data, remodel this data in some way, but I really wanted to tell stories too. And so I wanted some semantic content, and I wanted that to be available as part of the form. So in a way, what I settled on in the end ultimately was the prose poem, which is the dominant form of the book, and the sentence, partly because what struck me about that is precisely in its modesty as a formal gesture, that it was behaving in some ways in the way in which these endocrine disrupting chemicals behave, which is that the body mistakes them for so-called natural hormones. They just behave and fit into the substance of the body without being noticed. And so I liked the way that the sentence itself, as an utterly familiar technique, and the prose poem in that case lent itself to the subtlety of this procedure. But I was also, the more I thought about it as well, I thought of the sentence itself as kind of containing a small little dramatic arc. You know, there's an impulse, a verb, and a noun, and things happen inside a sentence. And so I like this cascade because it represented for me also the way in which hormones operate and behave. Again, quite subtly, but things move. There's a meaning, there's a cause and an effect inside a hormone in the same way that you can analogously, find in sentences. So that ended up being the structural formula. It's not very flashy, but it was the one that I was attracted to in the end because it allowed me some flexibility to work within, to semantically convey some of this information, but also work with the subtlety of the endocrine disruption itself. And some of the new stuff that I've been doing, I have been exploring with ways of modeling horizontal gene transfer as a literary form. I didn't read this piece today for you, but there have been I am working on this as well, shifting back and forth between narratives as forms of transition, identifying what you might think of as a kind of gene of a story inside a story or a poem, and then transferring that back and forth. These are mechanisms that I've been working with as well. But the question of form for me is constantly an ongoing concern. It's a wonderful question you ask, because I think about this, and it remains for me a constant horizon to come back to the question of the limits of writing.
Hi. So I felt like in anatomics and also in this talk, you mainly focus on bacteria. And are you also interested in all the other organisms like worms, parasites, and like their coevolution with humans?
Yes, I also have a sequence. I didn't read it here, but I did a fair amount of work with cockroaches. And cockroaches are fascinating creatures, in part because I was interested in them, first of all, for the way that they recur in all kinds of different literary texts in different ways. Kafka's The Metamorphosis famously, and that was actually the text I worked with on my experiments. But cockroaches are intimately involved with human global metabolism. Wherever humans go on the planet, cockroaches follow, and they tend to follow our trade routes. So they're involved in commerce and shipping. And so I was interested, again, sort of thinking about these links between global metabolism and local metabolism. The cockroaches are very much involved with that. And they also have very interesting thermal regulatory properties. And so I did some experiments with heat and the cockroaches. They may well do very well in a warmer world. We can think about the kinds of selective advantages that we are generating through climate change. I mean, some creatures, a lot of creatures will do much more poorly, obviously. We're in the midst of extinctions. But there were some who will benefit and profit from these shifts and able to find their own niches. And so I was playing partly with, and there is this cultural there are these cultural associations with cockroaches as well, that they are invulnerable, right? They are famously resistant to some forms of radiation. So it's the speculation that they will survive any potential nuclear holocaust. They'll outlive us. And so I was working with them for all kinds of reasons, but I was doing some heat experiments with them, seeing if their biomass changed if I raised the temperature by a couple degrees. They weren't in any harm or any danger, but I wanted to play with this subtle 2-degree temperature change that, well, we're already going to blow through that. But nonetheless, so I have been working with other organisms. So I did develop some poems. I actually let the cockroaches. They lived for 5 weeks on top of the first 2 pages of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and they ate it and they shit all over it, and so then I took it and I saw where they did what they did, and I wrote poems out of the material that they gave me. The other really interesting thing about cockroach shit is that it is a chemosensory device, so it actually draws other cockroaches. They smell and they come. It's an attractant, so it serves this biosemiotic purpose as well. And so I followed the feces on the page as a result of this in order to construct the poem. I should have showed it to you. In any case, I do have some slides of that, but I don't know if I have them here. No.
Okay, but what I actually meant was more the worms and parasites that are inside of you.
Oh, so do you mean if I... sorry, ask your question again?
Okay, so you focus on bacteria, but do you also think about parasites that live inside you, but are multicellular organisms?
Okay, no, that's a good question. So I did the sort of snapshot genomic look into my gut, and I was looking for some of the... I didn't find anything. I didn't find a whole lot of parasites. Now, it wasn't a complete picture, but there was nothing sort of obvious that stood out. So some of those organisms were invisible. I'm sure, yes, I can imagine times in my life where I've had that, especially drinking water right out of the lakes. Giardia is pretty common, so I'm sure I've had bouts of that. But for whatever reason, those were not picked up on the snapshots that I did. But I am interested in those. Yeah, for sure.
I have a question from Gerardo, actually, who is saying hello and thanking for your talk. And he is asking about, he says, thank you for your fascinating talk and wonderful poems. And he said, yesterday we were talking about metabolism and metaphor. And the question is how you would relate them to each other, metaphor and metabolism. Metaphor and metabolism. And I guess, because I also wanted to ask you a question about metaphor, though mine has a slightly different angle. Because I'm wondering, at which point your use of certain scientific vocabulary, for example, becomes metaphorical, and whether you, or even when you speak about writing, when you speak about messages, or when you speak about, for instance, polymers being a kind of writing, whether you think about this, at which point these expressions become metaphorical, yes? And so whether this question of I guess the general question is, how does the problem of metaphor play into what you're doing, right? And also with regards to metabolism, which, because sometimes you address metabolism in this very narrow literal sense, and then you also speak about metabolism as a global metabolism of capitalism.
Right.
Whether you think about the question of metaphor, the ethics also of metaphor, does that make any sense whatsoever? Because I changed, I read Gerardo's question, then I added my own, and it's really complicated, but maybe you know what we mean. No.
Okay, yeah, let me start with the ethics question first, partly because I guess what I see my work doing, and certainly metaphor is a potential operative dynamic here, is I think that, at a very basic level, it's hard to care about things that you don't notice or that you don't see, or that don't signify in some way, or it's easier to care about things that you do, that do signify for you. So at some level, at a very basic level, it seems to me art and environmental art, eco-poetics, poetry, whatever. I mean, I think art in general does this, but shifting frames of signification to make things matter that didn't matter before. This is what interests me about art, and I do think that that's a fundamentally ethical gesture to do that, to shift frames of signification so that, oh, okay, I hadn't thought to look at that thing in that way before. And so I would say fundamentally metaphors which do this, which bring things together, that create the yoke together these disparate elements that you hadn't thought to bring together before, that in itself is a fundamentally ethical gesture. So there's a kind of ethics inherent within metaphor itself. So I will say that as one thing. But the thing about this work that I'm doing, that in some levels it's profoundly unmetaphorical, which is to say it's extremely literal. I'm sort of, the body is text. Yes, the body is text in this case, which is to say to actually read the microbial constituents of a body and look at that as text as opposed to speaking about it metaphorically. But that tension is always in the work, of course. I mean, I'm fascinated by metaphor, and I do. Gerardo and I were talking about this yesterday in quite intense and interesting terms. To think of metabolism itself as a potential metaphorical activity, which is to say that it draws from all kinds of different contexts in an ontological, material way. A specific way, ultimately a material way. You're drawing together amino acids. You're drawing together elements from your oxygen from the atmosphere, and iron and phosphorus from the dirt, and you're bringing these things together to create an organism. So there's this sort of disparate yoking together, this kind of unity that happens as a function of this, as a function of metabolism, which you could see as a kind of metaphorical process in terms of bringing disparate elements together. So yeah, I mean, I think that I'm deliberately kind of playing in and around both with the literal, the non-metaphorical, and the metaphorical itself, quite deliberately in order to create tension between these two things.
Hi, thank you for your inspiring talk. I have a question that has to do with the meanings and functions of a pronoun, actually, and the pronoun my. I'm wondering, because we very often, when we refer to the body, we say, in our own body, we say and emphasize my body, my gut, yes, my uterus, my teeth, my microbes, right? But at the same time, we rethink the body and embodiment as porous, as outward bound, as part of a larger network of relations. And I'm asking this because it was pointed out to me quite recently, like how to reconcile that gesture of using my, like also habitually, as if, to refer to what we, again, own, right? With this kind of gesture of decentering agency and the dispersal of agency. Like, do you have any thoughts on this kind of a tension and conflict here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think that I think that ultimately, I like to think that in this work and in the kind of trajectory that I'm taking through this work, that decentering happens necessarily, which is to say that any assertion of the my here as an orientation, as a point of departure, is exploded by the results, or by the the recognition then that the my, or the being, is a composite being composed of these other substances and elements, of which I have ultimately no ownership, because I can't. I mean, as much as the microbes are in me and they're mine, they're also not mine at all. I have no control over where they go and what they do, to a large degree. I mean, my health is dependent upon them. There's a certain autonomous force that they exert upon me and inside me. So there is that undoing of the self within the self. But your question is a good one, and I've thought about it quite a bit. I mean, I think that with this work, I feel that I do need to ground my identity and work from that point of departure, as opposed to, I mean, there are, of course, the processes and substances that I'm interested in do connect to other people. Fundamentally, everyone in this room would have different metabolic pathways within you, but nonetheless you would arrive at very similar kinds of behaviors inside the body to derive nutrients from food, etc., generally speaking. So there are kind of generalizations that can be drawn from this, but there's very particular and distinct roots within those things. But I do feel that I need to start from the position of my own subject position and be aware of that as I speak. But I'm indebted, I think, as I think about my work in the context of, say, auto theory as a sort of emerging discipline. You know, and this really owes a lot of its history to feminist writing and women who have, you know, which was devalued at first. Or it was always, you know, the idea that writing from the perspective of the self is not serious scholarship. You know, you shouldn't do that. But women writers, you know, the history of feminism is filled with women writers doing exactly this. You know, grounding themselves from these points of departure. So I'm actually like indebted to that philosophical, critical, theoretical tradition. I see it more and more as I do this work.
We need to be wrapping up slowly, but there will be an opportunity to continue in a moment in a less formal context. So I hope you don't go anywhere. But ending this sort of official part, thank you, Adam, one more time for your great talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Bye.